before the world knew the name, before the stadiums, before the headlines, there was only a boy standing in a small house in Gary, Indiana, where music wasn't a dream, it was survival. That boy would grow into Michael Jackson, but tonight's investigation is not about the superstar. It's about what came before him, because every case has a beginning, and sometimes the beginning explains everything the ending never does. Official records and interviews confirm a large musical family environment led by Joseph and Catherine Jackson. But what stands out in this case is not just structure. It is discipline and repetition. Music was not optional in the Jackson household. It was daily practice, daily correction, daily refinement. And inside that system emerged a group of young performers, the Jackson children. Soon the world would know them as the Jackson 5. But at that time, they were just children trying to match rhythm, timing, and perfection under pressure most adults would struggle to handle. By the time Michael was very young, reports and historical performances show something unusual. While most children were learning identity, he was learning performance structure, timing, breath control, audience control, and most importantly, control of emotion on stage. Witness accounts from early performances describe something consistent. A child who didn't just sing, but studied the reaction of the crowd while performing. That detail matters in this case file because it suggests something deeper than talent. It suggests adaptation. Here is where investigators must pause, because this is where interpretation begins, not conclusion. When a child is placed in a high-performance environment early, identity can merge with skill, play becomes rehearsal, rest becomes absence of progress, and so the question emerges, was Michael Jackson becoming a performer, or was performance becoming his identity? There is no legal answer to that question, only patterns. And patterns are what we study here. As the group developed into the Jackson 5, their early success under Motown Records changed everything. Hits such as I Want You Back, ABC I'll Be There became global sensations. But behind the chart success was something less visible, a schedule of constant rehearsals, performances, and public expectations. Michael Jackson stood out immediately, not just because of voice, but because of control. Observers from the era frequently described him as unusually precise for his age. Not random talent, but structured execution. Here is where the tone of the case begins to shift, because success introduces something new, expectation. An expectation never stays the same size, it grows. In interviews from later years, Michael would reflect on childhood performance life with complexity. Not simple joy, not simple pain. Something mixed, something layered. That is important, because real investigations avoid one-dimensional conclusions. As we close this first file, the investigation does not end. It expands. We are left with questions that will guide the next episode. When does discipline become pressure? When does talent stop belonging to a child? And when a boy grows up inside applause, does silence ever feel normal again? And most importantly, did the world see a child becoming a star, or a star slowly replacing the child? There are moments in history when talent is no longer the story, when performance stops being entertainment and becomes infrastructure, a system, a global machine. This is one of those moments, and at the center of it is a name the world already knows, Michael Jackson. But before the stadiums, before the record-breaking numbers, before the cultural domination, there was a transition no one could fully see happening at the time. A transformation from child performer to global cultural engine. And what the public never saw clearly was that this transformation did not happen in one moment. It happened in layers, quietly, relentlessly, and permanently. because fame does not grow evenly. It accelerates, and when it accelerates too fast, it begins to reshape the thing it is attached to. Tonight's case file is not about success. It is about what success does to a human being when scaled globally. Case file update. Subject: Michael Jackson status transition phase detected from group performer to solo global entity. Before the world knew Michael Jackson as a solo icon, he existed inside a structure known as the Jackson 5. Within that system, every member had a role, every movement had timing, every performance had repetition. But even within group success, patterns began to emerge. One member began to draw more attention, not by force but by precision, by emotional expression, by control. Observers from that era described something subtle but important. While the group performed as one unit, Michael's presence often became the focal point of the audience response, not because others were lacking, but because attention naturally concentrates where emotional clarity is strongest, and this creates an imbalance, not musical, but structural. Because in entertainment systems, attention behaves like gravity. Once it begins pulling toward one point, it rarely returns evenly. Eventually, a shift occurred, not publicly dramatic but professionally. Strategic. A separate identity began forming. Solo path, this is where many documentaries rush, but the real investigation slows down. Here, because this is not just career movement, it is identity. Extraction. Michael Jackson began recording solo material that would separate him from group structure, and this separation is critical because once a performer becomes a solo entity, they are no longer protected by shared identity. They become singular, exposed, focused, amplified, and amplification changes everything. The album Off the Wall marked a major turning point. It was not just successful, it was structurally important because it proved something essential. Michael Jackson could exist outside the group system. The sound was different, the rhythm was more refined, the execution more controlled, the emotional range more deliberate. This is where analysts often miss the deeper layer. They focus on popularity, but investigators focus on change indicators. And here the indicator is clear. The subject is no longer reacting to music trends. He is beginning to define them. This is the early stage of cultural influence formation, where an artist transitions from participant to architect. At this stage, something critical happens. The system around the artist begins to expand, not just audience size but industrial structure. Media attention increases, production budgets increase, expectations increase, global reach increases. This expansion is not linear, it is exponential, and exponential growth has consequences. The human center remains the same size, but the surrounding pressure multiplies. This is where many performers begin to fracture internally, not publicly, internally, because the world is no longer watching a performance, it is watching a standard being set. Then came the escalation point. Thriller. At this stage, Michael Jackson was no longer an emerging solo artist. He was now a global focal point, a reference point, a benchmark. Songs such as Billie Jean, Beat It, Thriller did not function independently anymore. They functioned as a system, a coordinated cultural shift. The visual industry changed, music, video production standards changed, global broadcast expectations changed. This is where the phrase machine becomes relevant, not as metaphor but as structure, because what was created was no longer just music. It was a synchronized global media event. System. But investigators must always ask, What does scale do to the individual at the center? Because while the world saw innovation, the subject experienced something different. Loss of privacy becomes constant. Identity becomes public property. Every expression becomes interpreted. Every silence becomes analyzed. And this creates a condition rarely discussed in entertainment analysis: perpetual observation pressure, where even normal behavior becomes symbolic, and symbolism is heavy because it removes neutrality. During this phase, observers note a pattern: increasing perfectionism, increasing control over performance output, increasing separation between public image and private self. These are not conclusions. They are indicators, because when a subject becomes globally interpreted, they begin to manage perception constantly. And perception management is not natural human behavior. It is adaptive behavior. Case file observation. Subject has transitioned from performer to global system component, but one question remains unresolved. At what point does a human stop being shaped by ambition and start being shaped by expectation? Because once a machine is born, it does not stop growing. It only demands more input, more output, more perfection, more presence. And in the next phase of this case file, we examine what happens when the machine begins to look back at the human inside it. Case file continues. There is a moment in every rising story when attention stops being admiration and starts becoming pressure, when a performer is no longer just watched, but analyzed, measured, interpreted. This is the moment the case file shifts again, because now the subject is no longer simply rising. He is being watched at scale, a name already known globally. Michael Jackson now enters a phase where visibility itself becomes a burden, and what the world does not always realize is that observation is not neutral. It changes the thing being observed. Case file update, subject status, global observation phase, public. Attention, extreme pressure indicators. Increasing during this phase. Something fundamental changes in the subject's environment. The focus is no longer only music. It is presence, appearance, behavior, interpretation. Every movement begins to carry meaning beyond intent. Every expression begins to receive external explanation. Every silence becomes a headline waiting to be written. This is not unique to this case. It is a known pattern in global fame systems. But in this case, the intensity multiplies rapidly, because the subject is not just a performer. He is now a global reference point, and reference points attract constant comparison. As media systems expand, they do not just report reality, they amplify fragments of it, and fragments are dangerous because they are incomplete, and incomplete information invites interpretation. Interpretation becomes narrative, narrative becomes identity, identity becomes public property. At this stage of the case, the subject is no longer fully defined by self-expression. He is increasingly defined by external perception, and perception is unstable. During this period, the subject's music begins to reflect broader themes, not as autobiography, but as emotional response. Songs like Billie Jean, Beat It, Man in the Mirror become interpreted in multiple ways by audiences and media alike. Each one carries different emotional signals: tension, conflict, self-reflection, societal commentary. But investigators must be careful here, because interpretation is not evidence. It is perception. Still, perception matters, because perception shapes reality in public systems. At this stage, a psychological loop begins forming, not officially documented as one single event, but observable in pattern behavior. increased. Attention leads to increased scrutiny. Increased scrutiny leads to increased pressure. Increased pressure leads to increased control of self-presentation. And increased control of self-presentation leads back to more attention. This is the loop, cycle that feeds itself. And cycles like this do not stop easily. They escalate. At this point in the case file, we must pause the external narrative and examine the internal cost of constant observation, because humans are not designed for continuous global visibility. Not at this scale, not without consequence. When every action is observed, authentic spontaneity decreases and awareness of perception increases. This creates a condition where identity becomes partially performative even outside performance. Not intentionally, but adaptively. Something subtle begins to shift in this. Not a single event, but a feeling in the public atmosphere. A sense that the subject is no longer simply evolving, but being defined from outside more than inside. This is the core tension of this case file, because the more visible a person becomes, the less private interpretation they are allowed. Case file summary. Subject now exists in a fully global observation system. Attention is no longer local. It is worldwide, continuous, permanent. And this raises a critical, unresolved question. When the world watches someone long enough, do they still see the person, or only the image they created? And so we reach the end of Volume 1. Not the end of the story. Not even close, because what we have examined so far is only the rise, the formation, the beginning of global identity transformation. But the next phase goes deeper, much deeper. Before we continue Volume 2, we want to hear from you. Was this a story of success, or a system slowly reshaping a human being? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because every perspective adds another layer to the case file. And if you are following this investigation, make sure you are subscribed and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next volume, because what comes next changes everything. Case file Volume 1 closed.